At some point in the past, I have talked about using Vue components on a web application that is not a single page application. So basically, any JavaScript that I build, I will put into a Vue component, and then in sort of a straight Ruby on Rails or a Laravel application, I can just sort of embed those right on the page and use them like as if they were written in JavaScript. I recently got a question of how. How do I do that? What is the setup for that? This video is going to show basically how I have that set up in one of my applications right now. This application is a Laravel application, but it's pretty standard setup for anything that you would be using in any kind of MVC or modern MVC framework, including Ruby on Rails or Django or anything else. So I think a lot of what I am doing here is pretty easily applicable to something else, but you'll have to maybe kind of figure out some of the specifics as I go along. I'll try and use generic terms for a lot of this stuff so that you can more easily sort of transfer from one to the other. So let's take a look at this. So this is the application that I have, which you can actually go and check out at downtowntx.org. This is an application I built for the state of Texas, their historical commission, and it lets them manage historical properties in Texas. And before I would use a component library called Riot. And Riot was nice because it let you build single components that you could then embed in any web page that you wanted to without any kind of compile step. That library is sort of, in my mind, a little outdated at this point. I've really gotten into Vue, and I like the way Vue has these things set up. And so I've migrated a number of these over to Vue, but Vue needs a little bit extra help. Vue components cannot just be put onto a web page and have them run. They need compiled, cross-compiled into a JavaScript version that web pages actually understand. So there's a couple of extra little steps in here for that, but I'm going to walk you through those and how I set that up on here. The first thing to realize is I write all of my components as single file components. So the format that has a template at the top, and then for that template, then you have a script tag that sort of holds the logic and the data for these components, and then an optional CSS tag that will have this on here. So this is not JavaScript, really. It's something that needs to be compiled into JavaScript. But there are compilers out there that will do this for us. So I write all of these components as just .vue components. They have a big UI part at the top in the template. Getting into the script, they have props, just like any Vue component would. They have data. They have methods. This is just standard Vue component stuff. So there's nothing special here that is outside of what you would normally build for any Vue component, whether that's in a single page application or not. So if you do happen to build some components in a single page application and you want to use them on a web page, and you've built them sort of, separated enough from the rest of the application, you should be able to do that and just drop them right in here. You can see in here, I can even sort of importing some JavaScript code from another piece that I wrote for the Riot tags, which I can pull right in here and use, and it's not that big a deal. So this is pretty standard. You're going to write your Vue components just like you would any Vue component, and you can unit test them just like you would any Vue component. And it's just the standard out-of-the-box single file component structure that you would expect in Vue. Now the key is I have that, but I need a piece of JavaScript that I can use to load this component onto the page. And I do that with what I call a loader script. So I have in my assets under the Vue folder, I have a loaders folder. And the loader is just here. So every component has a loader, and the loader is here to get this onto the web page. So the first thing it does is it imports the component. This is some testing that I've been running through. Right now they're running in development, so I put the production tip equals false. I actually think that's kind of standard for a lot of Vue stuff. And then I'm creating a new Vue object, giving it the components that I want it to load, and then telling it to mount onto any tag that has an attribute of data-view-app where it equals document preview component. So I have a little tag for every single one of these components that if I put this into a certain HTML tag, when this JavaScript loads for the loader, it will automatically mount those components onto those tags. And so using just a data attribute is an easy way to sort of set that up and makes it pretty standard across all the different components that I'm using. So this is pretty simple. A lot of these loaders look just like this. They pull in a component and they mount it on the screen. You can see I'm using this new view. So this is a view 2 component. I set this up before view 3 came out. I know there's a little different syntax for this, but it's probably generally the same idea of how this works. And then, so this JavaScript is then used in a partial. So most of these languages, most of these MVC frameworks have the idea of a partial. The partial here is, again, a Laravel partial, where I set up a div that has my data view app attribute on it, and within there, now I can use my component. So I can mount a new component in here that is my document preview component. I can set all of the props for that component using data from the MVC. So this is data coming from the server side. And partials are what you need to get that server-side data into your view components if you're not doing a straight AJAX call. So this is data that's being put directly on here, and I can then pass that directly into the view component, and the view component will then have access to all of this data when it's actually running. And a lot of these are URLs. So URLs are being generated from my routes in Laravel. And so these URLs are then called by the view component to pull data via AJAX and then use that within the component. The second part of this is then including the JavaScript loader on the page. This mix right here is just basically I'm versioning these JavaScript as they get compiled. And so this is the direct link from Laravel to basically say, hey, this is the JavaScript file that you want to load. So this all gets pushed into a scripts section in the partial, which then gets included in the header once this page actually gets rendered that includes this partial. So kind of three pieces here that need to be built. First, the component, which is just a normal view component. Then a loader JavaScript that includes the component and then mounts that component on the page. And then a partial, which is what your templates are going to use to include this component on whatever page you want to include it on. So the partial is basically the piece that is actually a part of the MVC framework that you're using. The other two are JavaScript pieces. And the reason we need this loader in here, which is kind of a middle person in here, right? Like in scripts, why couldn't we just include all of this in scripts? Well, it's because the view component does need to be compiled. And so I have this Webpack in here. There's a little tool in Laravel called Mix that will compile JavaScript and CSS for me, or Sass, or whatever I want to use. And so in here, I'm actually passing in the path to the loader scripts and then telling it to go put it in the public JavaScript folder. And so all I really need to do is tell this to compile the loader, and then the loader includes the component, and so the component also gets compiled, and any other pieces that get pulled in by the component will get compiled as well. So the loader becomes sort of the one-stop entry place to actually get in there, compile your JavaScript, and then it's available for your partials to use once your page is actually being rendered. So, all of this is happening on deploy, and then the partial is used on render when someone actually asks for a page. The partial gets used to embed this, include the component, and then show it on the screen. And this has worked out really well for me in this application. So another question is can these components talk to each other? And they actually can. So you could set up a Vuex store that you then, on the loader, you could embed it in when you load the components in, and then they would all be using the same store, and any data you put in there, all the components would still be able to hear it. Even though they're kind of in their own little view context, they're still within a shared JavaScript context. And so if you have your Vue store set up as a const and you're exporting it from a JavaScript file and you import it into a component and you import it into another component, they will both have access to that same Vuex store. I'm also using in this application specifically a universal service bus that I can emit events on and listen to within the components. That way, I actually have my Vue components talking to some of the legacy Riot components and could also talk to some other piece of JavaScript, and they're all using that same bus, and so they all can actually communicate with each other within that. And that made a lot of the transition to Vue very easy to do, because then that was the only way that they were all talking to each other anyway. This is the value, of course, of separated and isolated components when you build these applications. And so hopefully this is a kicking off point, at least in some way, to how you would be able to do the same thing in your application. Whether that's a Ruby on Rails application, Laravel, you could probably take this pretty much wholesale from what I've got here. Django is the same way. What you really need to do is you're writing your Vue components, you put them in a certain place wherever your uncompiled JavaScript goes. You make a loader file that would have the same thing. You then include the loader within whatever sort of asset pipeline you have that compiles your JavaScript or your CSS into something that can be used by the browser. And then you just create a partial that includes that JavaScript and includes all the code needed to actually mount that on the page. With most partials, then you can pass this data in when you include the partial, and boom, you have your Vue component on the page. If you try this out and you get anything working or you run into some problems, I'd love to know. And I could probably help out with some of that. I've done Ruby on Rails before. I've done some of the other, a lot of these work the same anyway. So it's really a matter of figuring out what your format is that you need to do it in, and then just working with that in order to get something running.